is the visionary founder and executive director of MEER, comes from a multidisciplinary background in physics, chemistry, engineering, and natural science. He was formerly a researcher at Harvard University there, has left Harvard basically to focus on the mission of preventing heat from developing on the planet, and that's what he is focused on with the MEE organization. He's leading the development of sustainable engineering, adaptation, and mitigation structures with the goal of deploying these innovative strategies in some of the world's most climate vulnerable regions, including Africa and India. The Independent, the newspaper's Climate List 100, honored Dr. Tao as the top reader's choice for his contributions to climate action in 2024 as a, quote, true unsung climate hero. Please help me introduce and give a warm welcome to Ye Tao, the founder of MEER, and the inspiration behind everything we're talking about today.
Thank you, Herb. So the title of my talk today is Principles of Sustainable Global Cooling with Energy and Material Constraints. So the previous discussion ended with constraints. And generally in this culture, we don't really like constraints. We think, we teach our kids, everything is possible. You can imagine whatever you want to be in the future, and you will be that if you give enough effort. But the problem is that there are certain rules by which the world works. And oftentimes, when we think we can be net zero, just invent a term like net zero, we think somehow we can just get there without having examined whether the laws of physics and of society really enables are compatible with such a vision. There definitely are constraints. There's plenty of evidence. For example, we are often talking about mitigation versus adaptation. If there was no constraint whatsoever, there wouldn't be negotiations. We'd just give money and energy to everyone to do everything they wanted. But that's not the case in the real world. And even in the triage, the three-pronged approach within the community that recognize the importance of all three elements, there's still discussion of the priority of each of the legs of the stool. So there are definitely constraints. And we think that somehow we can decarbonize, but if we look at the data of what's really happening with the world of energy, we see that there's no sign of decarbonization whatsoever. We think there's a great increase of renewable energies over time. That's true, shown here on the right. But at the same time, fossil fuel capacity has been increasing at an even faster rate, 50% faster than the total combined increase of wind and solar. And if we look at the plot on the right side, where the color are coding whether a country as a whole is increasing its emissions or decreasing, we see that there's a very interesting trend where all the countries seem to be converging onto a per capita consumption of roughly 20 to 30 megawatt hour per person. And there are some deviations. For example, China seems to be a bit too to the right side of the curve, and Europe seems to be somehow under and to the left side, but that's partly due to exportation of emissions because we're buying stuff from China. So they're bearing the brunt of the blame. But everybody, or at least it seems to be a natural property of the system to converge onto that kind of per capita consumption. At least that's a just manifestation of a property of the system, which we don't fully understand. So there's a lot of assumptions that goes into the call for net zero. So today we'll take a step back, first look at the theory, very fundamentally, of how the universe that we can observe actually works, and then we'll talk about how that informs engineering and solutions to global warming. So let's first look at what's around in the observable universe. There's essentially three categories of ingredients. There's materials, there's energy that powers the transformation and movement into conversion of those materials, and there are a set of physical laws and engineering constraints and technologies that we have access to enable those transformation of materials and energies. And there's a certain structure to this world. We can conceptualize everything as a box, a reservoir of something, like your coffee cup or your bathtub. And generally, there is a way to add to that pile of stuff and a way to take that out. We call that a source and a sink. And a familiar example that's relevant here is to consider the reservoir, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we can add to it by a variety of means, including petroleum, rotting potatoes or a burning forest. And that CO2 also gets sucked out by a variety of means, different sinks, including dissolution into the ocean and also growing potatoes in your backyard, et cetera, et cetera. And now let's zoom in into only the conversion process in between any of these two nodes. And that's a process which depends on a set of physical laws. For example, in the case of CO2, its creation can be based on internal combustion engine as in technology of the process. And it's very important to see that in any of these conversion steps, there's a co-flow of both matter and energy. And sometimes you can start with something that has energy that's embodied in it, such as petroleum, and in the end, you can separate them out into a low energy state CO2 and some useful work of energy. But the law of nature, there's something called conservation of matter and energy, at least in the realm that we can observe, dictates that the number of carbon atoms in the petroleum to start with is equal to the number of carbon atoms in the CO2 gas that you produce. Same as the enthalpy of the petroleum versus how much heat and waste heat you generate in the end. So those are conserved quantities and a form of constraint. Clearly, the real world is much more complex, and oftentimes there's parallel processes happening at the same time. For example, the same ingredients, petroleum, with chemical energy, can also be transformed into plastics. And you can have also the same process, the two different processes contributing to the same reservoir of CO2. And then sometimes you can have a partitioning also of the energy into things that are now external to the material and ones that are now also integral to the product. Obviously, the universe is much, much more complex than the picture I drew. It's essentially an infinitely complex network. And you can have your own definition of what you consider as a node, like my coffee cup versus your coffee cup, or the collection of all coffee that exists in this building, right? And every one can have multiple pathways into and out of it. And for a system such as planet Earth, we also have more or less closed loop in materials, but not in energy. We'll come back to that later. So we now understand the basic structure, but these nodes can also change in time. Your bank account grows and shrinks, and the reservoir gets filled and dries. So how does that work? Every node has an inlet and outlet, and we describe that as the source rate and the sink rate. When, in the central case, when the two rates are equal, the amount of water reaches a static equilibrium, a steady state. But when the rates are unbalanced, for example, if you turn up the faucet much more than it can drain, then you will have an increasing amount of water and overflow eventually. In the reverse case, if you really opened your sink, then you will deplete everything in the end. So that's a picture of temporal change in the size of each reservoirs. And the condition for stability is that all the sink rates and source rates added together for each node has to be equal. And that's a necessary but not insufficient condition for what we conceptualize as sustainability. There doesn't really exist a rigorous definition of sustainability, even though there's a whole field of it and people are talking about it. And imagine for a second somehow we could maintain this set of living arrangements indefinitely. Let's say somehow CO2 just didn't exist, or the greenhouse gas effect didn't exist to the same extent, and we can just keep on consuming. And we could reach some static equilibrium of 4% wild animals and 96% humans and their livestock. It could be stable, but maybe it's not very desirable. Similarly, in terms of wealth, we can certainly imagine we can just maintain this set of inequalities, but I don't think people would conceptualize as a sustainable arrangement. So before really being able to understand how to define sustainability in perhaps more objective fashion, let's look at the other component, the software that humans have added on to the human system on Earth that's impacting how nature really evolves. Well, so regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, or even which country you live, generally humans were in pursuit of prosperity, well-being, and general human flourishing. And in the end, it's just a biological manifestation or basic manifestation of biology of reproductive success for a organism, because we're animals after all. And success in the biological sense is defined by the ability to maintain population. Of course, we can discuss that later. And the different approaches are based on different values. And each of those person that espousing those values have different assumptions. But empirical evidence seems to be consistent with that the individualistic, anthropocentric, material accumulation focused way to achieve prosperity, well-being, and flourishing is leading to climate meltdown. Whereas historically, empirical evidence suggests that at least over millennia, hundreds of years, a more communal way of living might be more durable. So now I mentioned the word durable. So it seems like to properly define sustainability, you also have to have a personal choice of the time scale horizon over which you wish to maintain the system stable. And I would argue from a evolutionary mammalian perspective, the time scale is probably somewhere between 100,000 years and 1 million years, because beyond that, evolution would have changed the whole species completely. But certainly not decades or years. And that has implication for what kind of solar radiation management response we choose to implement. Now let's just talk about a few examples of constraints and see how we can utilize our understanding of the physics of the system, the network, nature of the world to achieve something called adaptive mitigation. One energy constraint that's imposed on the current society is the cost of energy. Energy is not free. You have to go dig it, even if it's fossil fuel, and you have to build wind turbine solar infrastructure to capture the sunlight or any momentum in the wind. And the measure of the price of energy is energy return on investment, EROI. There's a very strong correlation between EROI and the level of human development that can be achieved in different locations. We don't fully understand whether that's a law of nature or there are ways to tweak the human societies to make the curve look differently, but at least in the current way that we organize ourselves, it seems like we really need to be accessing energy that's cheaper than EROI 15, EROI greater than 15, to have acceptable levels of livelihoods. So that's a constraint. And what does that constraint say about the feasibility of carbon capture? Well, anthropogenic energy total usage is 6 times 10 to the 20 joule per year. And if you do the calculation, if we used more than 3% of that amount, that overhead would translate into effective EROI much lower than 15. So we cannot really spend more than 3% of what we have available for environmental repair, including climate repairs. Therefore, we have 1.8 times 10 to the 19 joule per year to do all the environmental protection work that we wish to do. But nothing is free in this world. Everything carries an energy cost and a material cost. And the energy cost for direct air capture, based on the latest data, including ones that are in addition to these that I listed, is about 15 times 10 to the 9 joule per ton CO2. Therefore, if we spend everything at our disposal for environmental protection, for that DAC, we can capture about 1 gigaton of CO2 per year, which amounts to only 3% of total emissions. I'd like to highlight that the amount we spent, the energy available, pretty much equals the amount that we emit. And so as long as we are at least majoritively, to a great majority, basing our, as long as our economy is run based on fossil fuels, it makes no sense to conduct something like DAC. Because it's as if we have started another energy dissipation system for the sake of transforming fossil fuel buried on the ground into CO2 that's buried into the ground with the co-emission of just waste heat. So that's what DAC is, in the absence of a full economic and energy transition. All right, so what are some implications of the existence of such constraints in material and resources? One is that if we consider each of these needs, adaptation, mitigation, and carbon capture, as separate problems to be solved, then the sum of investment to each of the three is the total that we have available. But that's not a very efficient way to address the problem. Why? Because we know the world is highly interlinked before. And there's a sequence of how the energy transforms from one form to another. And they generally start with sunlight at the upstream. So we'll see how this directional nature of sunlight and energy conversions is conducive to designing much more efficient ways to deal with all problems as a system rather than individual problems. All right, so as I mentioned, energy flux is directional. It comes in as high-quality sunlight, eventually dissipating as radiation from the Earth, thermal heat. And the implication of this directionality is that if you perturb sunlight at the very beginning, the impacts percolates through the whole network. Of course, there's a decrease of impact as you move farther away from the initial impact, but it's nevertheless much stronger than if you were to only perturb thermal management based on IR emissions, for instance, such as cirrus cloud brightening. And an example mechanistically of why that's the case is because, say, sunlight is able to drive photosynthesis. It's able to impact plant physiology by virtue of, say, the UV components of the radiation. And also, it also impacts the temperature response of photosynthesis. Whereas, if you're only doing IR-based thermal management, you only impact the temperature component. In addition, if we can selectively perform sunlight modification as a function of location, we can selectively choose what part of the network that we impact. And this capability is unique to something high resolution like MEER relative to other solar radiation managements that do not have the spatial resolution or temporal resolution that we have access to. So let's recap the theoretical point first. Anything we do in this world, including to repair the climate, requires material and energy as a cost. And if we consider the different needs that need to be fulfilled as individual problems, we generally do not have sufficient energy, material, or time to perform the level of impact. And that the directional nature of energy flux within the Earth system and the ability to address the different sections in a spatio-temporally resolved fashion may enable the most versatile, efficient, and probably optimal response that we can have. All right, as we mentioned, isolating the problems leads to a persistent debate, negotiation, and inaction. So what we propose instead is that we focus the resource into, say, adaptation and design the processes in such a way that we leverage built-in mechanisms of the network to achieve as positive externalities, unintended consequences, mitigation and carbon capture. In this way, we can achieve a much larger equivalent impact than if we were to address the problems individually. So the example I will use to illustrate the process of adaptive mitigation is urban heat island mitigation. And then we will introduce a new concept of 3 new R's, and then we'll see how this process can lead to conventional carbon mitigation. The experiments we chose to conduct is to convert a lot of dwellings in this low-income community in Sierra Leone into heat-adapted dwellings. We converted many roofs into reflective roofs and thermally emissive roofs of different materials, as can be seen in the IR image. And the general finding is that during the middle of the day, we have a drop of average temperature by about 5 degrees Celsius. Extreme temperature are cut even more, by up to 8 or 9 degrees in the most extreme cases. So, for example, the bar over here is representing all the occurrences of greater than 40 degrees Celsius. And at night, we can also achieve cooling relative to background based on the type of material that you install on the roof. Obviously, the experiment is not how we envision the future, because if we were to just convert everything in that way, it's like addressing the problem as a single problem, right? We need to think about how these buildings are built. Right now, they're mostly built with concrete and metals, and those are themselves highly emissive. So as we are trying to impact many things, we need to think systematically and incorporate different things into the action. And one thing we're studying is to build the whole structure out of bamboo and the PET plastic. We have developed a method to construct really large-scale infrastructures, such as the floating roof that you see here, based on 100% or 99.9% bamboo and the plastic bottle. There's not a trace of imported metal or any fasteners in this structure. It's only plastic bottles, local bamboo, and this reflective material, which unfortunately has to be made using high tech, but still, nevertheless, quite affordable even for poor communities. All right, now let's introduce the 3 new R's that guide how we perform adaptive mitigation: reduce, replace, and reroute. The traditional 3 R's also include reuse and recycle. However, I think those are not really relevant, because reuse implies that the product is designed for single use, which doesn't make any sense. And recycle is a response that's completely energy blind, because it thinks, okay, separating out this plastic, washing them very carefully, drying them, grinding them up, we're free. It's not free. You're using so much infrastructure and energy for those processes. It's often much better in the current system just to burn the plastic. Much, much better, recover the energy. However, we can do better, as we'll illustrate. All right, but before discussing those elements, we have to reduce. So how much do we need to reduce? Well, we ask nature for some guidance. We don't know the exact numbers. Should we go to 10% or 1% of current global size? Well, the number to look at is the ability of natural systems to absorb all the CO2 that we're emitting. Right now, the land system is providing about 1.7 gigaton of carbon per year of absorption. But overall, the whole system is absolutely overwhelmed, because we have a roughly more than half of the emission is not being taken care of. Right? So if we were to only rely on nature for this sort of stabilization, the emission that we can have would, in the end, be roughly on the order of a single gigaton carbon per year, with the exact number to be determined. Well, that translates to about 6 gigaton of carbon per year, but it has to be less than that, right? Because right now, the rate of sequestering is driven higher because we have such huge excess of CO2. So we're driving by Le Chatelier principle, a faster rate of capture than it would be able to do under a less aggressive emission scenario. So the number to reach is much less than 6 gigaton CO2 per year of final emissions from humanity. All right, and in visual representation, the surface area of these symbols roughly represent the size of the human enterprise in CO2 terms that we have to aspire to or move design towards. All right, so in the future, what kind of energy can we use? Well, one often overlooked source of energy is actually traditional firewood, which, by analysis by Charles Hall, the pioneer of the EROI concept, seems pretty good. It has a energy return on investment of 30, much better than even domestic oil and other renewables, including nuclear energy, wind, and solar. And one can also achieve slightly higher EROI for biofuel wood if we don't chop it up into small chips, which reduces the efficiency to 25, and you can achieve greater than 60 EROI if you just use the whole blocks of wood as the fuel, because all the processing steps increases the cost of production. And the other way to make, say, fuel wood more reliable in the future is to reduce transportation. Obviously, transportation, that's another expenditure to get the fuel to you. Therefore, if we can keep transportation distance to below 100 kilometers, then generally it's a viable alternative for the future. I'm not advocating here for biofuel, just to be clear. I'm using it as an example to illustrate adaptive mitigation and how we reroute the system or approach to thinking about redesigning the system. So let's take the current situation of biofuel consumption, where every year we burn about 2 gigatons of trees to get about 31 exajoule of energy. That represents 5% of global energy consumption, emitting in the process about 10% of the global emissions. All right, so let's just assume for a second that's the future. We downsized by about 10%. Obviously, we have technologies, including renewables, that can complement that so that the total energy consumption would be up to about 10% of the present. One simple thing we can do is to replace the second R. Instead of using trees which are growing pretty slowly, we can use a faster growing source of cellulose, bamboo, to achieve the same flux in biological materials using about 1/5 of the land requirement. Well, that's an ambitious goal if we were to do the full switch, because currently we only have on the order of 1 to 10% the production that's in place for this complete global transition. However, the advantage of, say, something like bamboo is that it grows very well on not very fertile land, and that there's enough such land in the continent of Africa to enable attaining such a target. And the surface area required of 2 times 10 to the 12 meters squared, 2 million square kilometers, is also on the same order of magnitude, actually slower than how much we cut down in global forest over the past 2 decades. So it's not unimaginable to have a coordinated transition to managed bamboo agriculture. So simply burning them is very wasteful. So the third guiding principle is to reroute, additive rerouting of the different material fluxes. Before you burn them, why not use the bamboo to build architecture, structures that enable adaptation? For example, that swing bench. And if we were to instead use all that bamboo to build climate-adapted houses like this, each having 70 meters squared of reflective roof, we can achieve in a single year roughly 3.5 gigaton equivalent CO2 radiative cooling. And we can basically provide such dwelling to everybody within 10 years at the most. Every person having 35 square meters, which is quite spacious. The disadvantage of building only one thing is that, next page please. Well, let's just briefly mention that over the life cycle of this particular structure, we have a direct 5-ton CO2 of savings. Yeah. But the problem of this structure is that it's very heavily consuming in the bamboo starting material. Next slide, please. So if instead we built much more lightweight reflective structures like these floating mirrors, we can achieve a much higher radiative cooling efficiency per mass of bamboo utilized. And the flux that corresponds to generating 5 to 10% of current energy consumption would enable 45 gigaton equivalent CO2 per year of radiative cooling. There are many, many side benefits in addition to the direct radiative cooling, but we will address those probably in a discussion in the interest of time. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody, all the attendees here, all the MEERians who are here and remote, the collaborators, supporters, and also the HPAC and Herb.